I truly believe that engagement comes from understanding the importance of everyone, how this particular person impacts the success of the entire company. I think these days people are looking at employment as a stepping stone towards something else in their career. So they don't really care about the success of the organization.
Policies can be changed on a regular basis, providing there's a reason for the policy change. But what needs to be focused on right now by leaders is the strategy of the organization. Where is it going? How is it going to get there? How is it going to meet its revenue needs? How is it going to retain good talent so they're not consistently in the people search mode of the business?
For the hybrid conversation, every organization struggles with at what point do you put policy? You want to be flexible as much as you can. A lot of that really goes on the actual manager on how they manage that day-to-day and that interpretation of the policy.
I've been mystified for those tranches of people that got sent to work from home. Some of those included micromanagers. I'm interested to hear how they adjusted, and more importantly, how leadership, knowing that these people probably added value, but may have caused a lot of staff churn. And what do leaders need to do to help those people to rethink their behavior and their effectiveness on their team? Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm an award-winning strategic advisor and delivery executive. I'm focused on the rapid transformation of disrupted supply chain performance across the make, move, sell flow of consumer products and services from production to porch and assembly floor to shelf. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available from my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check these out. As the business world faces significant volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, business leaders looking to drive market-leading performance need to be tapping into thought leaders, strategic advisors, and implementation executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations, together with a strong track record of transitioning enterprises to become more agile, innovative, and digital. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the RetailAID podcast series, Retailing Conversations for the 2020s. Today we're going to be talking about the employee experience, and this is not just for retailers, this is for the wider business ecosystem, let's say. I've got some great guests here to talk about the employee experience, but before we go into the subject, can I just ask Anne, Tatiana and Cornelius just to give us a quick blast on the background and also what their area of interest is in this conversation.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate that. Anne Bloom, I am a human resources operational consultant affiliated with the Osborne Group. We are a group of consultants working with businesses, small to mid-sized businesses, in helping leaders to understand what the world of work really looks like today as we've moved into a new phase of business and growth and development, not only for the business itself, but also for employees. This topic is important, Gary, because recruitment is so important as we take a look at the war on talent. It could be about reskilling people to help them and help maintain the skills within the organization. That's what I help my clients with. I help them understand the impact of development of employees today and the value that that will bring to the organization in the short and long term.
Thanks, Anne. Tatiana?
Thank you, Gary. My name is Tatiana Lazareva. I am headhunter recruiter. I have my own firm, Unicorn Experts. So I have 8 years of hands-on supply chain planning experience and the most recent 6 years supply chain recruitment. So I specialize in this niche and I help clients of organizations of different size to source talent in supply chain specifically when they exhausted their resources or when they need to explore other options. I tap into my network and I do precise headhunt. Of course, these days, hiring is not an easy process. We work with different obstacles, such as work settings, compensational, overall benefits package, and that's where I can screen properly and interview candidates and address potential risks at the early stage.
Thanks, Tatiana. Cornelius?
Hi, my name is Cornelius Wong. I'm a talent acquisition consultant with Metrolinx. Prior to Metrolinx, I've worked 12 years in supply chain and operations and made that pivot about 6 years ago into the world of recruitment. And my specialty is in operations predominantly now. I do occasionally dabble in some supply chain positions. And the other things that I do support the Humber College, they have a supply chain bridging program.
As we think about the employee experience and emerging from 3 years of tumultuous disruption and social change, although the reaction to restrictions in March 2020 has been well documented, often businesses have fallen back on policies reflecting a combination of factors, but not always with employee centricity in mind. What we saw during the pandemic were 4 core reactions by employees. Some struggled with their personal spaces, family management, and basically trying to be productive without the structured routine of going to the workplace to complete their tasks. Some took the opportunity to reflect on their work experience and commuting, with some taking the view to move away from the proximity of their workplace. Some, recognizing they were not happy with the jolt to their previously stable arrangements, took the opportunity to look elsewhere for employment or just withdrew from the workforce or retired earlier than planned. Many, nonetheless, whether they were essential or non-essential workers, stepped up to the challenges that businesses faced and learned new ways of completing their tasks and ways of cooperating with their colleagues to drive new levels of performance. As the restrictions eased, businesses seemed to drive their HR policies with one of 3 approaches: returning to the office, operating hybrid arrangements, often focused on the individual's priorities, sometimes not, and continuing to operate under a work-from-home basis, either through maybe a lift in productivity that was being experienced, or an office lease expiring, or other business factors. So as we look forward to the remainder of 2023, what are some of the key considerations leaders need to reflect in their thinking and their execution to ensure their teams are optimized to service customers in the best way possible, drive longer-term profitability, and importantly, retain competitive talent? So I'm going to hand over to Anne to respond to that point and open up the conversation. So Anne?
Thanks, Gary. Employers today need to realize that there is a struggle for talent. And the struggle for talent is because some offices are calling their employees back into the workplace full-time. And employees after 3 years don't want to come back. They enjoyed working from home. They developed a routine that has worked for them. And the productivity levels have increased significantly working from home. Employers need to, instead of making the decision at the leadership table on how to run the business and how to move forward, they need to ask their employees, what do they want to be engaged and to be motivated, instead of making the decision on their own. The answer is always not at the table, but it's in the room. And so it's important to ask employees what they want. Recruitment, as my colleagues will talk about, is becoming tougher and tougher because candidates are more interested in things like AODA, health and safety and wellness, and policies and strategies around that. You know, I've had people ask me, what's your ESG policy? What's your policy on mental health and well-being? And how can I help? Are there focus groups? So organizations need to be aware that recruitment today, the candidate has the upper hand because they are declining positions based on things that organizations might not think is important to them, and yet they are.
So on my end, I see that organizations use hybrid or remote, sometimes as a marketing aspect to promote their open roles, but I haven't seen a single offer where the work setting is going to be guaranteed long-term. Employers are very careful about what they promise and what they put in writing. There have been enough cases when candidates are out in the market after being employed for 2-3 months, simply because employer failed to deliver on that work setting aspect. So that's what I witness. And to your point that most employees want to work hybrid or remote, unfortunately, not everyone has this luxury to choose. There are many positions in supply chain and warehouse operations when they have to be on site. So we are talking about analytical jobs mostly that are operated on the computer. I always tell candidates, if you are looking for a job, consider it within a good radius for you to travel. So if it requires you to travel 2 hours and the job is remote, the risks are pretty high. And you as a candidate also share this responsibility. You cannot put all the blame on the employer. And of course, it limits the talent pool. If we start looking only for local candidates, every employer is different. For some companies, hybrid means once a month. For other companies, it means 3 times a week. So there is a lot of clarification required, and every case is unique. For some people, being at home may not be mentally safe. A lot of people are sharing the space these days, and it is not a quiet space for them to work from. So I personally have friends who are missing going to the office because their kids have grown up. They want to have an opportunity to dress up and socialize. That social aspect is still on the table. So I think if we try to please everyone, we may fail. But you're right, we have to listen to the employees. And when we hire, we have to keep in mind that they will need to commute in case we change the rules.
I'm going to pivot off, I think, from Anne and Tatiana. Communication, it's becoming a lot more important. Traditionally, when we do the hiring, we kind of go through that process where we don't really talk about some of these things until very late in the stages, where now we really risk losing the candidate. I think having that conversation maybe a little bit early in the process, setting the expectation. To Anne's point a little bit earlier about some of the other sort of benefits around diversity or other support, from sort of anecdotally from my side, that's a very small percentage, but not to say that that's not an important part of it. It is an important part as a total reward. It is an important part because oftentimes that's not something that people are comfortable to talk about quite early in this process. So we do make sure that those things are covered as we walk through sort of the total compensation package. In terms of a hybrid work, it's always part of the discussion. For Metrolinx, in terms of policy, like I think pre-pandemic the policy is working 1 day at home. But that's all consistently has been an equity struggle when the operations of Metrolinx heavy is in operations where you have frontline workers, and then meanwhile you have the back office folks. The other piece of it, for us, even for a lot of the engineering positions, they are still going to be site work. So I don't run into as much of that with that type of candidate, but I think for the hybrid conversation, every organization struggles with at what point do you put policy. You want to be flexible as much as you can. A lot of that really goes on the actual manager or how they manage that day to day and that interpretation of the policy. To Anne's point earlier, productivity has been sustained and in many cases have been better since organization that went to work from home. So I don't think that's lost on any organization. It is very hard when you have policy that's been in place for decades to change that and to change it in a way that it's all encompassing. They'll leave a lot of that room for line managers to manage those day-to-day expectations. Unless you have a performance issue, then that tends to be the part where working from home can be hard to really manage. But I think we're a lot of the policies is really looking out for those one-offs, because it's when everything goes well, we continue with it, but it's that one particular situation that really drives policy one way or the other. Gary pointed out initially that some are at the end of their leases, some are looking at renewing leases. So what do they do in terms of the workforce? They have to make a call, and it seems like everybody is sort of punting it down the road and seeing who flinched first and who is the first one to kind of make that big policy change. I believe that's probably going to be the trend that's going to continue. Everyone's just going to wait till one of the big organizations to make that change and kind of take the lead on it.
I think it's interesting to the point you just made, Cornelius, is early in the pandemic, there were some organizations like Shopify, and so this has been a catalyst for us to be remote working. We're basically a virtual company in the sense of we're all tapping away on computers and stuff. So we can drag people into the office, or we can just get them to work from home and save all that commuting time, and perhaps be a more flexible organization. To the point that we have a series of policies that existed pre-pandemic, and we may or may not have altered those during the pandemic. When we look at the general organizational structure, pretty siloed. I've been in lots of different organizations as an outsider, effectively looking in, and you're seeing some of the interesting dynamics between departments. Why have they got so much more money than us? Or how come they're working hybrid and we all have to come into the office? So you have policy, but if it's then down to the individual managers to refine that policy for their department, it becomes quite interesting. I would suggest that if we're making a proper new policy for going forward, as opposed to trying to modify what we've had in the past, to actually pick up all these nuances that have developed even in a relatively short period of time emerging from a pandemic. So I'd be interested to see what people's opinions are about how does an organization faced with these plethora of issues work through that carefully so that we don't lose people because they say, for some people, they've actually moved location. Now maybe our best position is that we actually want people to come back to work for a whole range of reasons, like cooperation, creativity, getting stuff done quicker than having to book a Zoom call and schedule that time.
Yes, policy is important, but what I'm finding when I'm speaking with my clients is that policies can be changed on a regular basis, providing there's a reason for the policy change. But what needs to be focused on right now by leaders is the strategy of the organization. Where is it going? How is it going to get there? How is it going to meet its revenue needs? How is it going to retain good talent so they're not consistently in the people search mode of the business? But the other thing that we found through the pandemic is that organizations have been questioning how do they manage performance of employees who are working remote or hybrid. And that old school mentality of if I don't see them, I don't know what they're doing is no longer working. And it's not about not seeing them. It's not about not knowing what they're doing. It's about managing your employees without micromanaging, but managing your employees and their level of productivity and making sure that they are meeting their goals and objectives as required by the organization, and that managers are having those conversations with their employees to make sure how they're doing and to see how they're doing in meeting their goals and objectives. And never before has it been more important on a hybrid or a remote environment for managers to be responsible and accountable for having discussions with their employees around performance, around what are they doing, around asking those difficult questions that popped up during COVID. Is there something in your home life that's impacting your ability to do your job? Managers need to build rapport and relationships with their employees than ever before, and they are more so important than ever.
I agree with you on the old way of managing people, when you have to see employees to ensure that they're not wasting company's time, company's resources. So definitely trust needs to be developed. And if someone is a newly hired employee or someone who is relatively fresh to the industry, of course, there is a period of time when they simply need to be in the office to learn the systems, to learn from other people. So there will always be a situation when someone spends less time in the office than another person. So we cannot really formalize it, especially when we are talking about smaller organizations that have less policies in place. So it's on an individual basis. That's how my clients manage those situations. And it depends on the seniority of the employee, how long they've been in the company, how much trust they have. There are different types of leaders, and for employees, there is a different level of importance. Some of them are facing early retirement and they moved away and they can sacrifice a few years. For others, their job is essential to provide for the family, so they're most likely to agree to anything that employer imposes on them. Of course, there will be talent that is going to leave, but to rehire talent, sometimes companies don't realize how valuable the person was until they start hiring to fill this position. There are hiring managers who still are not aware about the market, how much it costs. And on average, someone who you replace may be asking for at least 10-15% more, and different work setting, and more weeks of vacation. Because in Canada, we have international workforce. People want to travel back home, visit their families. 2 weeks of vacation is no longer enough. So they need this remote option so that they can work from somewhere else in the world. So there are many aspects that make hiring extremely difficult. And a lot of deals fall apart last minute. As Cornelius said, sometimes those details are revealed at the very final stage. And I personally lost count how many times I restarted the process. And of course, that's also a valuable resource, time.
Very, very true, Tatiana. We talk about building trust with your employees. And yet, how does an employer show trust if they're asking their employees to log out when they go on break, to log out when they go on lunch, to log back in when they're back from break, or log back in when they're back from lunch? They're keeping minute track of break time and lunch time and time away from desk. That's not building trust. That's micromanaging. A big problem with organizations who say they trust their employees, but their policies, their processes, their procedures say something very, very different. You also mentioned a very important aspect, and that to me is the world has become much smaller in the last 3 years. And people have moved away from Toronto who work in Toronto, and they're now living in remote areas because the cost of living is much less. They're having a better quality of life. They're able, through Zoom and through Teams, be part of the organization that they were with, and yet still be remote. And some organizations are asking people who have moved out of Toronto to come into the office 1 day a month. That they can do, providing they didn't move to Halifax and don't have to fly in, but they can still do that. But more and more people and more organizations are realizing that if you moved out of Toronto during COVID, there still has to be an accountability for you to be online as much as possible, to have that face-to-face connection with your colleagues.
It's important to turn on the camera when people are having meetings. There are so many cases when you just see names, not that you don't see them in person. Sometimes you don't even see them virtually. And how much power, or is it even okay to force your employees to turn on the cameras? These days, all those boundaries and policies, it can be tricky to have everyone with their camera on.
Some people have taken liberties because of COVID, and the dress for employment or meetings is not what it used to be. There are some employees who are in their pajamas 24/7 when they're working remote because that's their comfort zone. And they change their top because they have a meeting. And you're right, they don't turn on their camera because they haven't combed their hair, or they haven't put on their makeup, or they haven't washed their face. When you're working, you do need to still maintain yourself and be on camera and let people see you and who you are. That's
And
the way to build rapport today.
I'm picking up a lot of things here, like leadership style. That's a very important piece. When we look at through the pandemic, we haven't really seen a lot of leadership changes, or maybe it hasn't been shown. But the leadership style and training from the leaders, like Anne talked about, sort of that trust, and Tatiana talked about setting boundaries. You need a different style of leader now that it's becoming a lot more virtual. They need to be a lot more charismatic in front of the camera to convey the message, because they can't shake hands. You can't walk by a cubicle and say, how's your daughter doing? Because I know, they went to a little league games or things like that. So that is one part that has changed the dynamics of company culture, where a lot of the big companies before has like, we treat you like a family. How do you treat somebody like a family when you're missing that physical interaction aspect? And that sometimes leads to a lot of resumes that had really short stints because the loyalty wasn't quite there, because you can't build that culture. People that has been in the company before understand it, but the new hires can't really understand why you guys do things a certain way. That dichotomy of working from home versus being in the office, really feeling a lot of type of work settings that hum and that feel in the office, it's a big part of the draw to be working for them. That's the part where, when I go back to the leadership really needs to have to try and figure out, how do we convey that? How can we now virtually give them that really sense of the company and the culture that they are a part of? You wake up and you go to the desk, you don't really feel that part of it.
one of the interesting things that came up earlier in the conversation was this idea that people are managing their staff's time rather than their actual level of outputs or outcomes. I've been mystified for those tranches of people that got sent to work from home. Some of those included micromanagers, and I'm interested to hear how they adjusted, and more importantly, how leadership, knowing that these people probably added value, but may have caused a lot of staff churn. And what do leaders need to do to help those people to rethink their behavior and their effectiveness on their team?
What happened during COVID is that people were promoted before they were ready to look after remote teams. We're finding now that leaders have never received the right development to be leaders, and they don't necessarily have the right skills. And so that's a problem, because people are either doing their own thing and leading their teams, or leading with an iron fist, and there really is no in between. And that speaks a lot to me to the culture of the organization. And we know that culture has changed in the last 3 years in many organizations. And it's up to the leaders to build a strategy around, what do they really want their culture to be, and how does their culture impact their employees? I'm having discussions with my clients around, what is their culture all about? Do they like what their culture has become in the last 3 years? And if they don't, well, then why did they let it get there? But if they do, then how are they articulating that to their employees so that their employees are aware of it? But also, what training are they providing to their employees at all levels around the new way of work?
The controlling and anxious leaders who want to ensure that their team is working properly, they probably have their own fears. They are probably not sure about the security of their own job. So definitely that needs to be addressed from senior leadership to make sure these people are supported. These people have enough resources, because maybe they have unrealistic expectations and KPIs, and they're worried about the security of their jobs. Maybe they are experiencing pressure themselves, and they are projecting that pressure onto their employees. So I think there is a part of it, chain reaction as well. Sometimes people have a certain personality type. We can change it externally if people don't think that they need to change it. Like self-awareness piece is also important. I don't think they learn from lessons. If they lose employees, they are fully sure that they can replace them easily. I don't think that teaches them anything. Reality is the best teacher, I guess, and support. They need support themselves. As far as what candidates are asking for, it really depends. There are a lot of unemployed candidates who will say yes to anything. So they don't really screen for culture. And then after a couple of months, they become unhappy in their positions. That's why I encourage candidates to ask as many questions as they can and screen companies for what's important to them. So it's really important to take advantage of the interview process, because some of those processes are extremely short. 1-2 interviews, the job is urgent to be filled, here's your offer. And then while being on the job, the person realizes how bad or how good it is. So sometimes the job descriptions may be old job descriptions and they have nothing to do with the real situation of the business. But most of them are asking for extra vacation week from my experience. They do want hybrid and they do not want commute if they need to, but it depends on the role. For some people, it's a step up and they're willing to sacrifice their lifestyle a little bit if they know what it is for. If the job is not appealing, that's when we start doing nickel and dime, how many days in the office. Of course, you may be attracted by the charisma of the leader, but then in 6 months, this leader is gone, right? So you have to look at the job holistically and pay attention to the culture, how they manage the COVID time, look at the turnover, do your analysis, do this risk assessment, because I fully believe that candidates are as responsible for their happiness as the employers that are providing the culture. We all share responsibility. And as soon as we realize that, life becomes easier.
I'm going to go back to training. I think managers often don't get enough training when it comes to interview in terms of how they should really be giving certain information to candidates. For most managers, they don't like it. That's extra work for them. This is an organizational development. They have to make sure when a manager is in a hiring position, they must have some kind of training that's available to them to help them to be better at interviewing and be better at conveying the company culture as well as what they're selling in terms of the company. Why come and work for us? To Tatiana's point earlier, it's on the candidates' shoulders as well. Most candidates, they forget about, like, I can ask these questions. It's not part of training either in high school or in university. There's not like a course on how to find a job. It's a lot of nowadays YouTubing colleges that have those mock interviews. I think the mock interviews sometimes doesn't go far enough in terms of preparation. So that's often the case, whether currently working as an internal recruiter or before as a headhunter, that a lot of candidates just don't understand the process and they're afraid to ask questions. And oftentimes 6 months down the road, realizing, hey, I should have asked this question. I probably should have brought up this particular issue.
There's some really good points in there, Cornelius. The thing that's said by, I think, all three of you was about the culture. We talk about culture as if it's something that's quite well understood, very able to be described carefully and precisely as to the ways we work, ways we interact, how we report figures, how we reward success, a whole bundle of things. We sum up that wide expanse of how we make decisions on a day-to-day tactical operational basis across the business as culture. I suspect that many organizations do not understand their own culture. Think about it as what happens when nobody's looking, as simple as that. If we don't understand the culture and what we're trying to achieve through that culture, and therefore our strategy, our vision, it's not a surprise maybe that training people and onboarding them formally, socializing them properly into the business so it can be as productive as possible, as quickly as possible. I think there's probably a mismatch still. It was definitely, I'd say, in general, there was a mismatch prior to the pandemic. The pandemic shifted things around. People had to find different ways of working. Half their colleagues were remote, where they were doing the work in the warehouse, in the stores, wherever it was. So there was a separation. Leadership were often found remotely as opposed to on the floor, and that's understandable. But as we've resumed some working practices, I suspect that many organizations have pointed to things like leadership skills, culture, whatever it might be, and said, oh, yeah, we need to do some work on that. But maybe have not driven that with a sense of imperative that we need to describe exactly what culture is. We need to describe what leadership styles are required. And therefore, we can set out training programs, learning development schemes that allow us to move forward as an organization. So again, I just open it up for discussion, because I think these are things that are very relevant to the next 6 months. Because while we've got this mismatch between availability of talent and the need for talent in organizations, these things are critical to organizational success.
I think the criticality in business today is the engagement of your employees. And that engagement and talent management comes along with your onboarding and your orientation into an organization, where organizations talk about what the department that new candidate is in and how the department impacts the organization, and with the role that that employee is going to play that will impact the organization as a whole. And as you take a look at leaders, some leaders are not trained to interview effectively, and they don't know the questions to ask, and they're still asking questions like, what's your greatest weakness? If you were a tree, what type of tree would you be? All of those questions that just make no sense. The tell me about yourself question makes no sense whatsoever. And interviews today need to be more conversational, and they need to be able to find out about the person that you've invited into your office or into your team and how they will impact the team and what they're all about, versus what skills are they bringing? What attributes are they bringing? What did they do in the past? It's not about today, what somebody did in the past. It's about what can they do in the future for their organization, and training them to do just that. It is more important today to look to the future than to look to the past.
I agree with you on having holistic approach. I truly believe that engagement comes from understanding the importance of everyone, how this particular person impacts the success of the entire company. I think these days people are looking at employment as a stepping stone towards something else in their career. So they don't really care about the success of the organization. They know they'll stay there for a year or so, or until something better comes up. So you can see many cases when someone is employed, but they are actively or passively open for other opportunities. So they don't really see how they can impact customers' experience, how valued they are. And that's when we lose engagement. When they understand how they can change the end product or how they can make customers' experience better, we can see how much they start caring about the company. And when they care about the company, they will be willing to support, do more, but again, they have to be trusted. So it's a very difficult process, and it requires leadership with high emotional intelligence. We've been promoted people in the past based on how loyal they were to the company. Now we have to promote based on the personality skills, personality traits. And that's a new approach to the business. And I agree, my most successful interviews are those conversational interviews. That's when I learn the details that make a big difference in the future. That's when I get all my red flags as well, because the first conversational interview can show me, is this person complaining a lot? Is this person playing a victim? Is this person blaming their previous employers? Because as soon as they feel that they can trust, they will be willing to share more details, and that I think conversational interview are more effective long-term.
I absolutely agree. In terms of hiring managers, I think hiring manager needs to be a lot more strategic and understand. Sometimes I don't think hiring managers truly understand sort of the impact, and they always want high potential candidates. But they also have to understand when you hire a high potential candidate, it comes with additional work for that high potential candidate. You have to be engaging on day one on career development. Be prepared. This person is going to be with you for one year and a half. If you help them along the way, you're going to have a very good, healthy work relationship. You guys are going to build a very strong relationship, versus if you want to hire somebody that checks all the hand boxes and you can dump everything on them. And also understand with the current market, when you are hiring somebody that checks 7 boxes, what's the benefit of that? It's not going to be all additional work for him or her as the hiring manager, because now you can also help sort of mold and shape this particular individual to be a bit more effective for your organization. So there is a bit more strategy to hiring than, like Anne was saying, just kind of the old script. Like, we just follow this script. If they answer all those questions, we try and give them a score. Ultimately, we do score. We do use that. We do like to be quantitative when we are able to kind of pick one over the other. But you need to be able to try to translate that quality into a particular score if the organization is using a scoring system when they interview. I think that is very important in terms of providing some longevity, I think, in terms of for the candidate. So they can either grow internally or they can grow externally. And if you engage them, then the probability of them growing internally is much higher than them continuing looking outside, because they know there's growth opportunity internally.
It's a great conversation about retention. I think that culture and engagement allows for churn to go down and longevity to perhaps be restored for all the right reasons, as opposed to, I just want to turn up for a job and be here for the next 10 years. I think there has to be in today's world, a compelling reason for an employee to stick around in an organization for that length of time. And it must be more than doing the same thing year 1 10 times. There has to be growth in the role and navigation through the organization. As a final thought, we've had, perhaps from a Great Recession, the ATS became the big tool to sift 500 people down to a short list of 3 or 4 people you want to actually interview. The applicant tracking system, a piece of software which internal recruiters and sometimes external recruiters use to do that process of dealing with that funnel, so that you get some relevant candidates that you can invest more time in. We've got generative AI, ChatGPT, which people are using, and JobScan and things like that, these tools, which we can optimize our ability to be a perfect match for this job. At last, the employees or the candidates have now got the tools that can actually make their presentation, their resume, their CV, in such a way that it will skip over the ATS. The ATS is not the big problem now. It's the thing that Tatiana talked about, is we have to start communicating with the candidates to actually really get under the skin, because we need to make sure as leaders in a business that we are bringing in people who are a good match for our culture and where we're looking to move towards, as opposed to they look good on paper and they seem to answer the right question, but they may not perform well in this environment. And therefore, it's a distraction from where we're trying to get to rather than additive. So to wrap up this conversation, I'd just like to put that out and see what as experienced recruiters and observers, what your views are on the advent of ChatGPTs and tool sets that allow the candidate to present the best they can to get through to perhaps that conversational interview, or at least the interview.
AI is wonderful, but AI is not going to replace talent acquisition. It's not going to replace recruitment. ChatGPT, in my mind, is a way to get additional information on questions or conversations that need to be had to fully understand and integrate someone into an organization. But it's not, in my mind, going to help the employer find the right candidate. That still has to be done through conversation, through getting to know the employee, through listening and understanding personality and trying to align that to the culture of the organization and fit. Fit, in my mind, is still as important as it ever was, and ChatGPT or AI is not going to help establish fit.
Gary, I agree with AI and ChatGPT. We will see more and more perfect resumes, which will easily get through the ATS system. And I think it's a challenge because we need to justify human resources, how many people we have in those departments and how many people can be screening 24/7 and talking to these people. So definitely we are facing the resource issue. And of course, networking has to be part of the job search. That's what I promote when I talk to my candidates. Make sure you establish in-person communication, make sure you are a decent human being, that you are a recommendable person. Grow your social network, because when we work from home, when everything is online, we detach from reality, so much so that some people tend to stay in silos. They hesitate to talk to people in different social settings. So we have to continue expanding our network so that we can tap into for future hirings, because that in-person connection is so important. I personally don't have a sophisticated screening system because I'm a solopreneur, right? So I cannot speak to the ATS, but I know that sometimes, in many cases, ATS system is used as a database. So if you know special recruiters, if you know certain companies that you want to be considered by, of course, it's a good idea to check in and upload your resume on their online portals. That's important, but also following up. And again, we're going back to what Cornelia said. We have to establish loyalty and engagement while we are working in the company, because your ex-colleagues can be your future connections in some other organizations. So trying to build a stronger team will benefit you long-term as well, because I still maintain relationship with some people I worked with 8 years ago, and it's a great source of information sometimes, or references. So don't underestimate that.
Chat GPT it's not going away. I think it's going to get better. Hopefully it's going to be a bit more of an additive to the whole process to make things a little bit easier. But I think when, to answer Gary's question earlier in terms of ATS, I mean, I think sometimes ATS, it's given a lot more credit in terms of how good they are at screening out resumes, because at the end of the day, it's the parameters. If you don't know how to properly set your parameters, you are not going to filter properly. Gary and Tatiana and myself, we've done supply chain, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? You need to have good data to support having a good outcome or good sort of model. So this is the same idea here with most ATS systems. That networking piece continue to be very important throughout the recruiting career that I have. There's a lot of times the referrals that get the interview or ultimately get the job on paper does not look like the perfect fit. We still do references looking at that pattern. And oftentimes a word of mouth reference or somebody that have worked with someone else before coming from a trusted source as a referral goes a long way. So that networking piece is still very important, but you also have to be networking for quality, not for quantity, right? You need to have those quality networking conversations where you're able to get to be a bit more in depth in terms of your ability to do the job, and have a bit more of those conversations where they can truly understand that you are assets to either his or her company, or maybe one of their friends' company. So I think, that is not gonna go away anytime soon.
Excellent. So just to wrap that up, I'd like to thank Anne, Tatiana, and Cornelius for coming on board the podcast and just sharing their views about this very interesting, almost nascent subject of trying to work out what companies need to do next to make sure that they create the environment that people can prosper, their employees can prosper, and they retain that competitive talent. So thanks, everybody. Tune in to the next episode. More information coming your way. And thank you for listening in, watching in. Goodbye. Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your organization. You can connect with me via my website, RetailAID.ca, go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn and connect with me there. Please feel free to follow the experts on this podcast for more insights and to join in the conversation. I look forward to collaborating with you and playing an active part with your supply chain and business's transformation as you are inspired to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win.